Welcome to the Lethal Company Iceberg. Tier 1, version 45. Version 45 is the first big update that came out after Lethal Company started getting really popular, introducing things like the Nutcracker enemy, the comedy and tragedy masks, and even Rend. All of these additions are so iconic that it's weird thinking there was a point in time before these. But yeah, this update really boosted the popularity of Lethal Company and helped extend that massive wave it was getting all over YouTube. Modded. Lethal Company has a pretty insane modding scene. Whenever it's been a little while since the last update, you'll start seeing a lot of videos on YouTube about modded Lethal Company. And aside from mods getting really big when there's not a big update having just released, a lot of the mods are pretty hilarious or just game-changing, like one specifically called More Company, a mod that lets you play with more than just 4 people in your lobby. Aside from it being incredibly useful, you can also do things like customize your cosmetics in the game. Dungeon types. There's now 3 of these different dungeon types in Lethal Company. These dungeons are the interiors of the big buildings you collect scrap from. When the game launched, it just had the default one called the Factory, where it's a series of long hallways and sometimes long gaps you'll have to jump over. But this one is super common and, well, because of that, it's the most boring. But the second interior is quite a bit more unique. That's also my favorite, called the Manor. Aside from it resembling Resident Evil 1, which does make me have a pretty big bias, it's different from the other two. It plays oddly calming music, and you'll find places in this manor that are pretty cozy. Like you could just sit next to a fireplace and take a little break. But that's what makes it scary. You wouldn't expect a nutcracker to run around this mansion with a shotgun and kill you instantly. Yeah, this place is home to some of the most dangerous enemies in the game, and you could get lost very quickly with how dark it gets. This interior primarily spawns on Rend, with an 84% chance to spawn, but can also spawn on Dying quite a lot. And lastly, for these interiors, or dungeons, we have the recently added mineshaft. Mineshaft with lots of slopes and dark hallways with minecarts scattered around, but it also has a very long and complex cave system. Most of the time in the mineshaft, you'll see a series of normal interiors with minecarts and whatnot on both ends of this cave, but sometimes with it being procedurally generated, it just won't have one on the other end of the cave. But aside from this place being super dark and having a cave system that can get you lost very easily, it also spawns a unique and very scary enemy. But we'll talk about that in a later entry. Bracken rooms. This is the Bracken, an enemy that mainly watches you from the darkness and attacks in a pretty unique way. When you see the Bracken and look its way, it'll get stunned for a bit, backing off, and most likely going around a corner. If you don't see it at all though, it will run up to you and snap your neck. Okay, so it's like a Weeping Angel or SCP type thing. So what's so unique about it? Well, if you look at it for too long, it'll get angry and snap your neck anyways. So it's a very unique balance of looking a certain way for an amount of time, looking away. It's for sure one of the more dangerous enemies in this game because of that. If you don't know how to go against this thing and you're just looking at it scared, it's gonna kill you. So now for its apparent room. If you've been on the internet at all in the last 2 or 3 years, you'll probably know what the backrooms are. If you don't, it's like a big community-made SCP type thing based off of this yellow room. It would be a whole video in itself, but basically it's all based off of this one image. So there's a room in Lethal Company that looks quite a lot like this. It's referred to as the office in the files of the game, but when people initially see this, they just think, oh, okay, back rooms, and walk away. Well, this room somehow came to be known as the Bracken Room, a sort of myth spread through players of this game that if you see this room, it means the Bracken will spawn. Turns out, in reality, they have 0 correlation, but it was a pretty big myth or rumor that went around. I mean, I even thought it had a relation until writing this script. A lot of people believe since it looks like the backrooms, and in a way the term backrooms can sound like bracken, that if misheard it could sort of be mixed up in a way. We don't know for sure what started all of this, but yeah, this so-called backroom and bracken have 0 relation to each other. Monsters are descendants from Earth species. There's a theory that a lot of monsters on the different moons in the game are descendants of species here on Earth, and it does make sense. The bunker spiders, after all, are just spiders, but finding relations to other monsters can be a bit tough. I guess the loot bug could be some type of fly, maybe? This one isn't confirmed, but would make sense. But it's even mentioned in the bestiary entry for the bunker spider that they do live in many states. So I'm gonna assume that means something on Earth, with being a country or maybe part of the US. But yeah, they are just spiders. Like, we have those all over here on Earth. So at least the bunker spider is most likely a descendant. The drill. Underneath 71 Gordian, the planet where the company building is, where you sell all your scrap, is a big drill. Which, honestly, yeah, it looks a bit more like a missile than a drill, or even a submarine, but it is called a drill in the files. We don't know what it'd be used for, as all the information we have on it is that on the side it just says "don't tell" in all caps. My theory is that some of the employees, like maybe from the log entries we'll talk about soon, maybe made this in hopes of finding what is really inside of the company building, but there's no for sure answer as to why this even exists. Jeb. Yeah, this is Jeb, that big tentacle monster inside of the building that can kill you if you ring this bell too much. His name is Jeb. Jeb is pretty mysterious and has some creepy dialogue, but yeah, for a name that seems so innocent, it's weird that this giant monster is named Jeb. Logs. The game does a good job with world building to where we don't really need to read the logs to get an idea of what's happening in this world. I mean, at least knowing how to play the game, you really don't need to look at the logs at all. But the logs go into a lot of detail about some characters that reveal some terrifying truths about this world and the company. There's a lot of entries on this iceberg relating to these logs, so this is kinda gonna skip around tiers, but it makes a lot more sense being combined with these logs. Once you start your game of Lethal Company, you'll see a sticky note on the wall that reads, "You're in deep. Access file Sigurd." When you type the word Sigurd into the terminal, you'll be met with the first log entry. Log 1 is set on August 22nd, 1968. So yeah, before even starting with the logs, something is off. The copyright for the terminals when you first open them is set 2084 to 2108 by Halden Electronics. And the current year you play in is 2532. So the world of Lethal Company is quite a bit different from our own, as our first trip to space was in 1969, and in 1968 they're already traveling between multiple moons with ease. But back to Halden Electronics though. We don't really know much about them, aside from they do own the copyright on the terminal, the manual on the ship, and the company cruiser. But the actual log entry is written by Sigurd, and he talks about how the log entry feature wasn't even a thing until one of his crewmates, Desmond, added it, and that he hates his job. The turnover rate is so bad because people kept dying. There's not a whole lot of significance in this that we don't already know by playing, but in this entry it is important to know the names of the members of his crew. Sigurd, the guy writing these entries, Richard, Desmond, and Jess. Nothing really happens in the second log entry aside from Sigurd mentioning that Richard smells terrible, but I will say all of the log entries past the first one are found on different moons. At the end of the third log, Sigurd talks about the really creepy noises he heard behind the counter of the company building, and that when he uses his flashlight at the counter, nothing even shows. Okay, creepy, we're getting some hintings at stuff in the company building, but in the fourth log entry, found on a rend, we get some pretty interesting dialogue about a so-called golden planet. In this entry, Sigurd is talking to someone on the walkie-talkie next to the company building. The person on the walkie says that this golden planet myth is real. And yeah, if you're confused as well, don't worry. This planet hasn't been mentioned at all yet. The person on the walkie says that it wasn't just hit by a meteor, but that it was swallowed by a beast. And after that, they have no memory of anything. Sigurd couldn't get this person to stop talking though. They said that they were on the other side of a big wall and that Sigurd could get them out. Sigurd replied, stating that they were inside of the company building, and then the person started freaking out, and the only thing Sigurd could make out of it was, quote, something about spitting out the rinds. Then he turned the walkie off and was reminded by Jess that this golden planet couldn't have been real. But what if it was? After all, the most expensive piece of scrap is a gold bar. Maybe this beast that swallowed this golden planet was Jeb. Yeah, I know that sort of kills the creepy atmosphere, but that's the name of the beast in the company building. But is this beast big enough to swallow an entire planet? I mean, if he was big enough to swallow an entire planet made of gold, it would make sense that he would be contained. And the company building, of all things, is massive. The next log entry takes a pretty dark turn. Sigurd talks about how that when he was hired over the phone, that the voice didn't sound like a real person. And even the ship is autopiloted. Sigurd and his crew have never even seen or apparently heard a real voice of someone higher up in the company. And he goes on to describe nightmares he had of a fake version of himself returning home after finishing the season. And if you've played Lethal Company, you know finishing a season of this game, good luck. That's impossible. The next entry, titled Sound Beyond the Wall, starts off with Sigurd talking about how the company is buying at 120%, which doesn't happen. At no point in the game is this possible. which is already odd, but Sigurd again mentions that Richard smells terrible, then goes on to mention the creepy sounds he heard from the company, sounds of crying red faces all churned up and swept away by concrete, and that Jess, again, believes that he's losing it a bit and that these sounds never happened. And I'll just read out log entry 7 for you. We left behind Rich. We just had one room left to check and then we could be done for the day. I couldn't get the door open, and then I looked and Rich wasn't there. It was the fucking wrinkly skin flower head man that walks on 2 legs. It snapped his neck. I heard the crack, but he wasn't there. I wanted to find Rich, even if he was dead. But they're cowards. Their faces are blank like idiots. There's nothing moving in their stupid skulls, and all they wanted to do was leave. They were going to leave me too. We all hated Rich, but we didn't want this. This isn't worth it. It's just not worth it. We got a pair of scissors, a box full of stamps, and a bundle of cards to sell for nothing. It's not worth it. What does the company even want this for? The date we last saw Richard was September 7th, 1968. So yeah, Richard was unfortunately killed by a bracken, and the only one who wanted to at least retrieve his body was Sigurd. In the next entry, set 6 days later, Sigurd and the crew report the death of Richard, and immediately the voice on the other end says that they'll get a replacement with no care at all for the death of Rich. In the second half of this entry, Sigurd shows the others the voice on the walkie when you get close to the wall, and now they want to quit, but Sigurd is too scared for being branded a coward for leaving. In the next entry, the 9th, found on Rend, they're still waiting for a replacement for Richard, despite it already having been 5 days since they reported his death. But the crew gets an idea. They're obviously all scarred and traumatized at this point and really just want to know what's happening. Since Sigurd was talking about how the voice on the phone call sounded fake, and Desmond is a sort of genius, at least in Sigurd's eyes, Desmond decided to use the terminal to see if they could trace the phone call to see where it was coming from. Sigurd was obviously a bit confused. Why would you trace this call? But he played along. 9 days later, we get the next log entry. Turns out that Desmond was able to trace the call. It's coming from a group somewhere else that pretends to call from the company building, and they're completely across the solar system. Why would they be so far away? Well, the crew doesn't know. Sigurd also states that he believes there may be a big monster in the company building, like the voice on the walkie said. Which, I mean, with what you see behind the counter and the so-called golden planet, it makes sense. And talks about how they may just be feeding it scrap to keep it tame. Which would make sense, but why isn't it anything organic? Why not monsters or anything? Well, 1, the monsters are probably too hard to consistently kill, but 2, there's almost propaganda-like posters on the ship about preserving food, along with a real poster from the Great Depression, so they probably wouldn't have any normal food on Earth, or at least not enough to keep feeding this beast, hence feeding it all of this random scrap. In the next log entry, Sigurd talks about his terrifying nightmares he's been having, and that he does want to go to and see what's happening where they trace the phone call, but it'd be too dangerous. And Sigurd at this point doesn't even remember what life was like prior to getting onto this ship. He doesn't even remember saying bye to his dad. Then he starts talking about how he's fed up with life on this ship and has been seeing Richard around in different places on moons. And Sigurd is really starting to lose it. He misses his dad. He talks about how he hopes that his dad isn't staying on Titan, which we'll get to later, and that he just wants to go back. And for the last log entry Desmond, October 15th. I'm encrypting these logs to keep them hidden, as I fear the system will be wiped if they're found. It's all a guise. We're supposed to think it's all just a transaction, but our real job is keeping an incredible terror fed. How long until this fullness ends, and the hunger is insatiable? God knows. Maybe it has to do with all of these desolate rooms. Whoever reads this, I'm sorry to burden you with this. Please have a good day and night, as what else is there for us to do? So we don't really know what happened to Sigurd. This last entry is written by Desmond, but we can assume that something happened to Sigurd, as there's no mention of him, and he usually writes all of the entries. At this point, Desmond believes the theory that their job is just to feed a beast, and for the time, that is what we're going off of. Now for the quick summary. These logs take place around 500 years before you go and are able to read them in the terminal, and all of them, aside from the first one, are found on different moons. Sigurd is the main guy who wrote the logs, and he left his dad on Titan, which he's worried about because there seems to be a conflict starting up there. His crew consists of him, Desmond, Richard, which for some reason is mentioned that he smells awful all the time, and Jess. Sigurd hears from the walkie-talkie while standing next to the company building that there is a massive beast that swallowed a golden planet, and that voice was someone on the planet, which leads them to believe that the beast inside of the company building is the one that swallowed the golden planet. Turns out that all the work they were doing was just to keep this beast fed so it doesn't break out and go into a frenzy, and they're feeding it scrap because there's a food shortage. There's propaganda posters all over the ship that talk about preserving food. Richard unfortunately ends up getting killed by a bracken while they're all finding this out, and the voice that responds to their notice of him dying sounds robotic, just like the voice that recruited them. This led them to trace the call and see where it was coming from, and it wasn't a company building. It was somewhere super far away that they couldn't safely get to. In the last entry, which is written by Desmond, which isn't normal because Sigurd normally writes these, he describes that he's having to encrypt the logs so they don't get discovered by the company. Now, getting past those logs, which will come in handy for later entries, not all of the monsters in Lethal Company are made equal, some way more powerful than others, and one of these extremely powerful monsters is the Old Bird. Old Birds were added in version 50. These Old Birds are dangerous. At the start of a run of one of these moons, they'll be not moving and harmless, but if you stay a bit too late, they'll wake up and start flying, trying to crush you, stomp on you, shoot missiles at you, and if you're really unlucky, it'll grab you and use a flamethrower on your face. These things also can't be killed. They most often spawn on Embryon, but even landing on this moon is sometimes a death sentence, as up to 20 of them can spawn there. The Barber. I didn't even realize this creature existed until now. The Barber is very rare. I mean really rare. Added in version 55, also referred to as the Clay Surgeon, the Barber's highest chance to spawn is 13% on Dyne and 11 on Embryon. So for most people who usually get to Rend and then have some issues, this guy's very hard to stumble across. But even when you do stumble across him, you may be a bit surprised. The only indicator this creature will give you of its presence is a horn toot whenever it moves. Aside from that, it's completely invisible until you get close enough. If you are close enough to see it though, you're probably seconds away from being cut in half by its scissors. Oh, and it's invincible, so good luck if you ever come across this thing. And lastly, with these monsters, added in version 60 alongside the mine shafts, the Man-Eater is a very unique enemy. When you first come across it, it doesn't seem dangerous at all. This creature just seems like a small crying baby, but if you don't soothe this baby in time or get too loud around it, it'll transform into a big spider-like creature. And yeah, this thing kills you pretty much instantly and is one of the most dangerous creatures to say the least. Titan is Saturn's Titan. There's a theory that the Titan moon in Lethal Company is the same one in our own solar system that orbits Saturn, and with some modding we can sort of get an answer as to if it is or not, as at the start of a Lethal Company session, if you go out of bounds, you can see a planet that does look a little bit like Saturn. I mean, it shares some similarities with some color and whatnot, but it gets interesting when we view Titan. Titan looks very similar to its real-life counterpart. Both real-life and in-game Titan are extremely icy and cold, and I think even if lore-wise they aren't the same moon, even though that would make sense with Earth being referenced multiple times, even if somehow they aren't lore-wise connected, they're for sure at least very inspired off of the real-life one. Same name, same look, it makes sense. Also shout out to Broncosti for being able to guess what iceberg I was working on by me just posting this picture of Titan on my community page. The spore lizards have been domesticated. In the bestiary entry for the spore lizards, these little guys, they've been domesticated. And aside from lore-wise being domesticated, they're also one of the nicer enemies. They'll only attack you if you get really close to them, but if you see one, it'll try and flee anyways. If you get really close to it, it'll either bite you or run away and produce this weird pink smoke and run away. And they're invincible, though it doesn't really matter with how nice they are. As long as you keep some distance, they're no threat at all. Skinwalker and Mimics. These Skinwalker and Mimic mods are some of the most popular, scary, and hilarious mods in Lethal Company. The Mimics will imitate fire exits, and if you try and go into one of these fake fire exits, you'll be eaten. There are a number of ways to tell if it's fake, like weird things with lighting and whatnot, but if you go up to the door and it says feed and you go to interact with it, yeah, don't do that. Don't feed yourself to the door. It's pretty easy to avoid. The Skinwalkers are a bit creepier. The Skinwalker mod will sometimes take things that other players in your lobby have said and make them come out of a monster, if that makes any sense. So say there's like a thumper around the corner, you could just hear your friend saying, "Oh, come over here," and then you go to it and you get killed. But sometimes you do get something pretty goofy like this. 68 Art. 68 Art, or 68 Artifice, is an odd to get to moon, and the most difficult of the moons. Having a hazard level of S++, to unlock this moon, you'll need to head over to the cottage on either Rend or Adamance, where after you unlock the first door with a key, you'll be able to see 68 Art on the wall. Well, if you type this onto the terminal on your ship, it'll unlock the secret moon, 68 Artifice, for 1500 company credits. You don't need to go into the cottage to unlock this, you can just type it immediately, but either way you're gonna need all of those credits. This moon is dangerous to say the least though. It's filled with old birds, and even though there is a good amount of cover to hide from them, having 4 warehouses, it's very easy to get killed by them. However, it is the best moon in the game for loot, so it's worth it. Tier 3. Who is on the phone? I'd say one of the biggest mysteries for the lore of Lethal Company is who's on the phone? Who's pretending to be the company so far away from Gordian? Well, this one is up in the air, but a lot of people think it's something to do with the intro cinematics for the updates that I'll show you later on. As of now, we still don't know who for sure was on the other end of the phone, but hopefully in the next update when we get another log entry, we'll find out. Lasso Man. Lasso Man doesn't work correctly. It has animations for walking and attacking, but they aren't used. Instead, Lasso Man will slide across the floor and deal no damage to the player upon contact. And this is because it wasn't meant to be implemented. He'll sometimes spawn on the moon Voima 10, but it's a bug. His animations, attacks, everything in the files not being implemented. When this does happen, it's odd that he's even able to move, but from what we could tell in the files, he would have killed players with strangulation and kind of acted like the Bracken in a way. Unfortunately, Zeekers, the maker of Lethal Company, has confirmed that he won't be added back in. Sigurd's dad and Titan being an uninhabitable planet. As mentioned in the logs, Sigurd has a dad, and he was said to have lived on Titan. But when we go to Titan, yeah, it's not really habitable. Aside from the expanse of snow, the only building in sight is the place we go to for scrap, which obviously isn't very safe. So did Sigurd's dad possibly live here? Are all of these abandoned buildings once colonies? It seems like it. Most of the entries for moons when you go to land on them say abandoned. And sure, the log entries do take place 500 years prior to us showing up, but we still don't really know what happened. We'll get more into that later on. Interplanetary war theory. In multiple log entries, it said that Titan was once a livable place, and a very popular place too. I mean, that's where Sigurd and his dad lived. But now it's desolate. Well, there's a very popular and supported theory that there was a war that caused this. Most moons you go to mention that they were mined for resources, and usually followed with something like, it's now empty or desolate. If we are just feeding the company beast to keep it from ravaging everything, as the log entries hint to, it wouldn't be unreasonable to believe it's extremely old as well. I mean, Sigurd and his crew were selling scrap to the same building and creature 500 years ago. So this theory goes that back in the 1960s and 70s, when Sigurd's crew was active, there was a war, and it would make sense. The war would have been over this beast, and since obviously the food and scrap they were giving it wasn't enough, with all of the advertising about preserving food, I mean, you'd want to keep your own planet or moon safe from getting eaten like the Golden Planet was. So if you're running out of resources and you're in desperate need, what do? Resource war. The planets went to war with each other to take control over resources and make sure that their own were okay. Worst case scenario, if part of your planet's population dies, that's more food you can give the beast. It's a very interesting theory and does make a lot of sense with the lore. Jeb growling/snoring. Whenever you arrive to the company building on Gordian, you can hear Jeb either growling or snoring. Personally, I think it's just him growling, getting ready to eat whatever scrap you have, but yeah, it's pretty loud. Tier 4. Forest giants and brackens are distant relatives. In the bestiary for the Forest Keeper, or more commonly known as forest giants, it states that these forest giants are believed to share a common ancestry with Rapix folium, which is the scientific name for the bracken. There's not much else hinting towards this, but the bracken's other name is Flower Man, so it does relate to the forest. I don't really know why the bracken is inside. I mean, it makes sense, it'd make it scarier, but if it is called the Flower Man, you know, I could see them sharing an ancestry. Who is the Ghost Girl? The Ghost Girl is a very weird enemy. It doesn't show up on the map from the ship and doesn't even initially attack you. That is until you encounter it multiple times. But even then, you can't even scan the Ghost Girl to find out more about it. So we simply don't know who they are, or if Sigurd's crew even came across it. Plushy Pajama Man. The plushy pajama man is a decoration you can get in Lethal Company, and it turns out that it's a reference to one of Zeeker's other games called the Upturned. Yeah, the version in Upturned is quite a bit scarier, but it is a very clear reference. Eject. If you type eject in the console of the ship, it'll start its so-called firing process, where it shoots everyone out of the ship. I imagine this is pretty nice for if you're screwed on a run and you just want to reset, but not a whole lot of people know about it. Other moons. All of the moons start with a number, like experimentation is called 41 experimentation. So overall, we have the numbers 5, 7, 8, 20, 21, 41, 44, 56, 57, 61, 68, 71, 85, and 220. So a lot of people believe this means that there could be more moons out there, being the other numbers that were assigned but we don't get to go to yet. And it makes sense that these could possibly be reserved for a future update. Snare Flea Critical Health Maximum. Lethal Company is hard and single player. Like really hard, but one of the sort of saving graces you get is that the snare fleas will never fully kill you. Snare fleas are these creatures that'll normally latch onto someone's head and will kill them unless hit by a shovel. But in single player, it'll bring you down to the lowest health and then jump off and run away. Sure, this doesn't seem like too helpful, but these guys are just kind of randomly about and will instantly kill you, so it is quite annoying. What happened from October 1st to 14th? The last two entries in the logs have a very big gap in time between each other. In fact, it's the biggest gap between any of the logs, being 2 weeks apart. It would make sense to assume that something happened to Sigurd between these two dates, since Desmond did write the last entry, and Sigurd was the one who mainly wrote them. With the way Sigurd ended his most recent log entry, it does make it seem like something happened to him, but it's not confirmed. Desmond mentions in the last entry that he's encrypting them, and that him and the crew found out that they were just keeping this massive beast fed. So Sigurd wouldn't necessarily need to write anything here, and after all, the entry is about keeping the logs secret, so random personal stuff wouldn't matter, but it is odd that he isn't there at all. We Are the Shadow Man. Versions 50 and 60 both added intro cutscenes to the game, and the version 51 is really interesting. We see what seems to be maybe the company building, but seemingly not the big wall on Gordian that apparently holds the massive monster. This time it's an actual office building, but there's alarms blaring and you hear screams in the background. At the end of the cinematic, we see a shadowy figure come through a door that wasn't there before, and the theory here is that we are that shadowy figure. And in the cinematic for version 60, it's sort of hinted at that. In the version 60 cinematic, you're floating in space and running out of oxygen, but before you die, a door appears in front of you and begins to open before cutting to black. So it's implied that at least whoever you play as in the version 60 cinematic is this shadow figure. I don't think playing as the character in the cinematic automatically means it's a character we play as, since, well, you play as a person in the office as well, but it'll be really interesting to see what happens with this shadow figure in the next big update that has an intro cinematic. 57 Deep/Deep 57. In the bestiary entry for the man-eater creature, it's mentioned that it was first discovered in the caves of Deep 57, or as most moons are referred to, number first, 57 deep. So the previous entry about other moons is right, at least in the sense that there are other moons, but if we go to 57 deep in the future is still up in the air. If we do get to, it'll be terrifying with this man-eater creature, but also if the numbers do go in order by system, 57 deep in theory would be close to Vow, since that moon is number 56. And it'd make sense since the default interior of Vow is the mineshaft where the man-eater is found. Tier 5, Decoy Suit. Out of the 7 suits in the game, one of these names doesn't really fit. For some reason, the default suit is just called Decoy Suit, most likely called this since the company doesn't really value the life of their employees. 123%. When you're in the process of being fired or getting ejected out of the ship, if you access the terminal and type moons, you'll see that the company is selling for 123%, possibly as a last-ditch effort to get you to sell the scrap to Gordian, but at this point, it's way too late. Trent. This is Trent, the goldfish. For some reason, the community of this game has sort of decided to just call him Trent. I don't know why, but everything I see about this goldfish is calling him Trent. How are all of the different species on different moons? Another mystery we don't really know the answer to. In real life, creatures can appear in different parts of the world since, the continents were together and eventually split, but the species were all about. But for Lethal Company, it's different. We're on moons. There isn't really a solid answer, but my best guess is that they were possibly brought there before the moons were abandoned, when there were actual colonies. And maybe they just turned hostile after the war happened. There's evidence of creatures like the kidnapper fox stowing away on ships, so that's another possibility. Just all of the creatures eventually getting onto one of the autopiloted ships, which would just go somewhere else. Rubber ducky. I couldn't find any images of the duck in this reference, but the rubber ducky and many other items come directly from Upturned, another game made by Zeekers. Like even the big bull in Lethal Company was originally from Upturned. The version 50 startup cutscene was the first attack. The theory that most people have agreed on in the Lethal Company fanbase support the fact that we are just feeding a massive monster to keep it from attacking. And while there had to be a first attack, a lot of people believe that this is the cinematic for version 50. And while there's not a whole lot supporting it, there's nothing really going against it. Obviously something is wrong in the building, and it looks like there would be an attack with all of the alarms blaring. So maybe this is the first attack that started the process of feeding this beast and eventually the wars. Tier 6. ITDA. ITDA, or ITDA, is a company only mentioned 3 times in Lethal Company, all in bestiary logs that are talking about taking action against different creatures. It seems like they're almost an animal control, but for extremely dangerous creatures found on these moons. I'm sure at some point they were helpful when they were active, but now all of the moons are overrun with creatures, so I don't think they are anymore. In-game diseases. The manticoils are already unique enemies with the way they're able to latch onto you and fly you around if you're light enough, but their bestiary makes them even more unique. In their bestiary entry, it said that they can transmit viruses like rabies, rubenchloria, and pit virus. The only one of those 3 that's real is rabies, but I have a sort of theory of my own. I really think with how often it was mentioned that Rich smelled terrible, that he may have had one of these viruses. I mean, it is mentioned an odd amount of times in the logs. Luckily in-game, we don't actually have any of these viruses, but it could be a really interesting mechanic that Zeekers might eventually implement. This wall cannot contain me. When selling items to Jeb, the big monster in the wall, sometimes he'll have some unique dialogue like this.
This wall cannot contain me.
This implies that the monster in the wall speaks through intercoms, or at least can speak through them, and that it has some form of sentience. So it may be even more dangerous than just a really hungry creature. This means it could have also been the voice on the other end of the walkie in the log entry talking about the Golden Planet, the Resistance. In the intro cinematic for version 60, there's flashes of text when the employee you're playing as blinks their eyes. The first one says, "A pardon, a defense, a tunnel, a hole in the fence. For all the weary workers does it exist." After that flash of text, at the end of the cinematic, we see this pop up. So this place does exist. This bit of text has led people to believe there's some sort of resistance possibly going on, and it would make sense if these flashes are some sort of message to the workers of the company. This is the only evidence we have of this, but it would make for some good lore. Desmond was the last one alive / Desmond is alive. There's a theory that Desmond was the last member of Sigurd's crew alive, and with him writing the last entry in the logs, sure, it makes sense. I mean, it's not said that any of the other crew members are dead, but that is the last one we have confirmed to be alive. Another part of this theory is that Desmond may be the employee we see floating in space in the version 60 intro. I really hope it is, personally. It'd be weird since the logs were from so long ago, but maybe it's some sort of weird time travel thing. After all, seeing a door appear in front of you randomly isn't exactly natural, so I don't think it's impossible. And that's the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, like and subscribe if you did, and have a great rest of your day, week, month, and I'll see you in the next one.